William Gladstone was a prominent Liberal politician of the 19th century who served for 12 years as Prime Minister in 4 non-consecutive terms. Undoubtedly a significant figure in our history, but a statue of Gladstone has been removed from outside a church in Liverpool while its suitability is debated. The question has arisen because Gladstone's father owned slaves in the Caribbean, although his son strongly condemned the practice. Joining me to discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome the historian and political commentator David Oldroyd-Bolt. David, thanks for joining me today. This is a very peculiar one because when it comes to Gladstone, he couldn't have been more unequivocal in his condemnation of slavery, and yet here he is being effectively damned for the sins of his father.
Well, exactly. The sins of the father shouldn't be visited upon the sons, but when it comes to Black Lives Matter, it doesn't seem that that takes effect. What's happened here is typical of the Church of England at the moment. In 2020, Black Lives Matter was a big protest, and the Church of England got its knickers in a twist because he thought, oh my God, we've got this anti-slavery thing going on, and we've got so much money from slavery, so much property, etc. What do we do? So what they've done is seized upon one of the most inappropriate people they could possibly seize upon in Gladstone. The reason that the bust was there, which was funded in part with Heritage Lottery funding in 2013, was because Gladstone came from Seaforth in Liverpool. His father's house, Sir John Gladstone's house, was Seaforth Mansion. And at Our Lady, Star of the Sea, he worshipped there. So they thought, we'll put this bust outside. It couldn't possibly bring up any controversy, and of course it could. Gladstone's first speech, his maiden speech, as they call it, was defending the rights of West Indian slave owners. But that was the only speech, I think, that I know of in which he did so. He later came to condemn slavery intensely and without any sense that he thought that this was something that, times have changed. He just said it was terrible.
Yes.
As he called it, that consummation utterly to be desired, the utter elimination of slavery. And indeed, when he was president of the Board of Trade in 1844, he halved duties on sugar from non-slave-using countries in order to try to persuade Brazil and Spain that they should abolish slavery. And this was directly against the interests of his own father. Sir John Gladstone wrote to the Times saying that this should not happen, and he and his son really did break apart on this.
So where is this coming from? Are there really all these activists clamouring for this bust to be removed?
No, of course not. This is a typical instance of the Church of England getting its knickers in a twist about a few people online who might have said something 3 years ago, and now refusing to put out an unequivocal statement that actually, having looked at the evidence, because this is about the evidence of what Gladstone did, not the perception of a few uninformed people, there is no reason that this statue, this bust, should not be on display.
And yet we keep having this argument about Gladstone. I mean, we had it with the Gladstone Gardens. In Liverpool, there was the one of the dormitories at the university, I believe, was renamed from Gladstone, but renamed after Dorothy Cuyer, who's a Marxist, who actually supported the Stalinist regime even after the forced labour camps were exposed. So someone who's actually pro-slavery.
Well, indeed. And are we going to, for instance, ban the Sydney and Beatrice Webb buildings or have them renamed at the London School of Economics? But they were great supporters of Stalinism, even when they found out what was going on, and even after the show trials. So it does seem that there's a bit of moral one-dimensionism here, that it's fine if you're a hypocrite if you're on the left, but by no means could you be on the right. And let's make it clear, Gladstone was the Liberal Prime Minister. He began as a high Tory, but by the time he was in his 30s, he was moving towards the Liberal position and only ever governed as Prime Minister as a Liberal.
So then why is there this historical illiteracy going on? I mean, they've even had it, there was the bust of Thomas Henry Huxley, an abolitionist, and they were saying we should get rid of this because of something he said. The fact that he campaigned for the eradication of slavery doesn't seem to matter. You'd thought that would buy them some sort of kudos, right?
Well, I think one of the problems, it goes back to what the historian A.J.P. Taylor, the mid-century historian, said, that the past is what happened, history is what we tell ourselves. And what's happened over the past half-century is that there has been a revision of what we used to tell ourselves about the role of empire and our part in it, but not forgetting that empire is something, or empires have existed for the whole of human existence. They are a natural part, it seems, of the growth and evolution of societies.
And not explicitly British, exclusively British.
Well, no, every great society in the history of humankind has evolved this thing called empire. There is, it seems, deep in our psyche, an atavistic part of our psyche, is the need to dominate others and to take wealth and to take land and to take goods. Now, this is not something that we solely, as Brits, were responsible for. It happened long before us, the Roman Empire, for instance, and it will happen long after all these people are dead and the petty squabbles over statues have been forgotten. But I think for the time being it's very important that we don't allow what is a very small number of people who are listened to disproportionately to either their importance or their knowledge or the verisimilitude of what they say.
Is it about the way in which people interpret what these statues represent? I mean, I think for some activists, they see a statue of Cecil Rhodes, say, and they say this is a celebration of all of his worst opinions. Other people see it as a landmark, an artefact of history.
Well, most people have no idea what Cecil Rhodes stood for. They've allowed themselves to be persuaded by an ahistoric and often false narrative about Cecil Rhodes. He was, as a young man, he had some views that we would not now find palatable, and he continued to hold some of these views throughout his life. But he also modified some of his views and believed, for instance, in the equality of the races in Africa and in India. He founded the Rhodes Scholarship, by which people of all colours, of all creeds, of all races, of all nationalities have benefited ever since he died. The idea that just because someone held once a rather unpalatable opinion should not disbar them from being regarded well in other areas. And I think this is one of the legacies of colonialism with which we have to deal. The Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe said the point about colonialism and our legacy with it is that it's complexity with contradictions. There is both good and bad. And the professor, or former professor of moral and pastoral theology at Oxford, Nigel Biggar, whose book Colonialism is published this week, has had this problem that his book would not be published. His original publisher, that is to say, would not publish it. He had to go elsewhere because people are so worried about anything that is seen as an apologia for colonialism. Well, it's not about apology. It's about giving straightforward, factual information about those bits that were good. For instance, I think that one of the great legacies of the British Empire was that in India we banned sutti, the practice of burning widows on their husbands' funeral pyres, and in Africa we tried to get rid of female genital mutilation long before anybody in the rest of the West was thinking about this. Equally, there are parts of it for which we should apologise, and I think have apologised for a very long time.
And it's interesting you mentioned Nigel Biggar's book. I know there is a dispute in terms of what happened with the publisher, which was Bloomsbury, and I know Bloomsbury deny or have a different version of events. Recollections may vary, I suppose, would be the phrase that you'd use. Nigel Biggar says that it's absolutely not the case, that there was a kind of backlash to the publication of this book. But isn't it quite an important corrective? I mean, whether you take issue with what he's written or not, but actually to have a book that talks about some of the more positive aspects of empire, at the moment, that's quite a bold thing to do, isn't it?
Well, I think just to have a book that isn't entirely condemnatory and against the facts. Trevor Phillips' review in today's Times, I think, is good on this, because it discusses where the book shows empire to have been a force for evil and where it was a force for good. And Nigel Biggar's tried to bring in this ethical debate about empire for quite some time now. Indeed, his 2017 programme, Ethics and Empire, was condemned in a letter to the Times by academics before it had even got off the ground.
And that was a programme at Oxford University?
Yes, it was just an idea that we should think about this, and we should try and think about it in the round, rather than condemning it automatically or indeed praising it automatically. Because that's not the way that debate happens. You don't just sit down and decide that for the next 50 years this is a good thing and this is a bad thing, and you can have no discussion about it. That's the most intolerant, close-minded, idiotic, frankly, sort of approach to any question of history.
But I suppose that the approach that the activists take is so emotive in terms of the language they choose, the imagery they opt for. They'll talk about how Winston Churchill was equivalent to Nazis or equivalent to Hitler because of his, what they say is his responsibility for the Bengal famine, for instance. I mean, but this is not a historically nuanced assessment.
That's just historically wrong. But this comes down to a point I've been trying to get across to people for a while. When activists, particularly online activists, start a discussion or start an argument in such bad faith, when they are coming from a position of straightforward untruth, stop giving them airtime. Ignore them. They're like toddlers who are running around screaming for more Smarties. Just say, no, sorry, no, we're not doing that. If someone comes forward and says, you know what, there were parts of the British Empire that were previously considered good that I think, because of X, Y and Z new pieces of information, we ought to reconsider. Fine. Let's reconsider them. Let's have an honest, good faith discussion. But just to allow the agenda to be driven by people who only want to condemn the past, who only want to say that we were dreadful people and our forebears were dreadful people for taking any part in this whatsoever, neither enlightens humanity, nor does it lead to more open-minded debate, and nor does it lead to better literature. All it does is lead to people disliking our forebears, who did, I think, for the most part, go about their lives thinking that they were doing the very best they could.
I mean, is it the case that activists just like to select those sort of egregious moments, things like the Amritsar massacre, but of course that was condemned wholeheartedly
at the time. Yes, by the government and by most people in charge. The Amritsar massacre was it was an appalling event. And when you mention the Bengal famine, We were in the middle of the Second World War. This was 1943. Churchill did, having looked at the papers, and Andrew Roberts' book on Churchill makes this very clear, Churchill did as much as was absolutely practical at the time to make sure that these dreadful events were mitigated. We sent grain to India to try to do what we could. We couldn't send as much as we would have done in times of peace because we were fighting the Nazis and because we were fighting the Japanese Empire at this time as well. We didn't have the resources. Churchill bearing responsibility for the Bengal famine is one of the great historical lies. The weather is to blame, not Churchill, not Roosevelt, not Stalin, as much as we might like to blame Stalin rightfully for other things that he did to encourage famine. This was not one of them.
David Oldroyd-Bolt, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.